Ruth Sawicki had 9 puffs left. She'd counted them that morning the way she counted everything, standing in a Greenpoint bathroom about the size of a closet, shaking the little plastic canister next to her ear and listening for what was still in. 9, maybe 10. It had to last until the 3rd of next month because Medicaid approved 1 inhaler at a time, and the name on the prescription wasn't hers. It was her brother's. Pete was 11 years old and his lungs were worse than hers, so the arithmetic in that apartment had been settled years ago. He breathed first, she breathed after. 27 years old, hair pulled back with a faded orange elastic she'd been wearing since she was 17, knuckles cracked open from 10 years of bleach and cold water. 3 jobs. A hospital debt she wasn't ever going to pay off. And 9 puffs in her apron pocket on the Tuesday morning. She rode the service elevator up to the 32nd floor of a building in Tribeca, where she had worked as a housekeeper for 2 years, without once laying eyes on the man who lived there. She knew his name, though. Everybody in Brooklyn knew that name. Augustin Falcone. 34 years old, a waist-hauling empire on the surface and something else underneath it. A thin white scar running from the end of his eyebrow down his cheek. Eyes the color of dirty ice. Men stopped talking when he walked into a room. Ruth had never seen him. She'd only seen his rooms, and that's a different kind of knowing. The 4 bedrooms he didn't sleep in. The refrigerator with nothing inside but water and pills. The coffee table that never had a single mark on it because nobody ever set anything down. She understood that man from wiping his counters better than most of his own people. Understood him after a decade. But she'd never seen his face until that morning, when she heard something behind the office door that she recognized instantly because she'd been hearing it her whole life. The sound of a person trying to pull air through a straw that's closing. She opened the door. The most feared man in New York was down on his knees beside his own desk, one hand locked on the edge of it, lips going the color of a bruise, and a couple of feet away on the carpet lay his inhaler, already used, already useless. Ruth had about 3 seconds to decide. She thought about Pete. She thought about 9 puffs. She thought about how if this man died on this floor, she'd be the last person to walk out of the room, and the police would want to know why. And then she thought about her mother, lying in a bed a long time ago, waiting for somebody to come. So Ruth Sawicki reached into her apron, got down on the floor beside a Mafia boss, and gave away 4 of the 9 breaths that belonged to her little brother. What she didn't know, what nobody knew yet, was that the empty inhaler on that carpet wasn't empty because he'd used it up. It was empty because somebody had let it be. And when Ruth picked it up off the floor and read the lot number stamped along the side, the way she read everything, the way she'd been noticing things, nobody thought she was smart enough to notice for 27 years. She was holding the one thing that could bring the whole house down. She just didn't know it yet. If this is the kind of story you want more of, do us a favor and hit that like button right now, because it helps more than you'd think. Share it with somebody who needs to hear it today. And if you're new here, subscribe and stick around. We've got a lot more coming. Now let's get back to that 32nd floor, and to the 9 puffs Ruth Sawicki had left. 4 puffs, and the most feared man in New York still couldn't breathe. Ruth knelt there, one hand bracing his shoulder to keep him from collapsing forward, the other still gripping the plastic inhaler, warmed by the heat of her palm. She counted silently in her head, not seconds, but rhythms, the rhythm she had learned by heart during all those nights spent sitting on the bathroom floor with her younger brother. Then the chest beneath her hand began to move differently. It didn't expand. It merely became a little less rigid, like a jammed door that had finally shifted open by an inch. Augustin Falcone drew in a breath, and the wheezing was still there, but it no longer sounded like someone being strangled. He opened his eyes. Those eyes, the color of clouded ice, searched for her face, and Ruth saw something in them she hadn't expected. It wasn't gratitude. It was terror. He was looking at her as though she were a witness. She pulled her phone from the pocket of her apron. It was a cheap phone, its screen split by a diagonal crack she had covered with clear tape. She began dialing. His hand closed around her wrist, not tightly. There was nothing strong left in that man at the moment. But it was the hand of someone accustomed to taking hold of another person's wrist and getting the result he wanted. "Don't," he said. One word. He had to stop for breath between every word, and each pause carried a price he had to pay. No car, no records. Ruth looked down at his hand. long fingers, neatly trimmed nails, a thin callus over the knuckle of his index finger. She had wiped the table he was clinging to for 2 years and had never once known what this hand looked like. "You can't breathe," she said. "I am breathing. You can say 3 words at a time. People who can breathe can finish a sentence." She removed his hand from her wrist. She didn't wrench herself free. She simply peeled his fingers away, the way someone might loosen a child's grip on a railing, and he couldn't take hold of her again because there was nothing left inside him with which to fight. Ruth didn't press the call button yet. She looked down at his rigid chest. "You're trying to breathe in," she said, kneeling closer to him on the floor. "That's where you're going wrong. Everyone gets that part wrong. You have to breathe out first. Breathe all the way out." All the way, she simply began doing it herself slowly so he could see. "Don't take a deep breath. Keep it shallow. 4 counts in, 6 counts out." And that man obeyed her. She counted for him in a calm voice until his breaths began to lengthen and he managed to sit a little straighter. While he focused on his breathing, Ruth reached down and picked up his empty inhaler from the carpet. She turned it over in her palm, her eyes traveling along the casing, and read the tiny lot number printed near the bottom. Out of habit, she slipped it securely into her apron pocket. Only then, she unlocked her phone and pressed the call button. She gave the dispatcher the address, the floor, the apartment number, and explained the situation. After she ended the call, Augustin Falcone stared at her. Slowly, 1 word at a time, he said, "You just killed me." Ruth didn't understand. Later she would. Later, she would learn that in his world, a medical record could be a death sentence. That there were people who had waited 20 years to hear that August Falcone couldn't breathe, and that she had just entered his name into a system anyone with enough money could buy their way into. But at that moment, all she saw was a man on the floor, furious, because someone had saved him, and she had seen that before. Her mother had once been the same way. "You wanted me to let you die alone on the rug I just vacuumed?" she said. He didn't answer. There was a silence, and that silence lasted longer than it had any right to. Augustin Falcone sat with his back against the leg of the table, his head tilted back. "No one can ever know about this," he said. Ruth heard what lay beneath those words. It wasn't fear, it was shame. The kind of shame she had seen in her younger brother every time he had to take out his inhaler in the middle of the schoolyard. "Do you know what my brother once told me?" she said. "He said he would rather sit there quietly than let his friends see him use his inhaler. He was 11 years old, and he had already learned that needing air was something to be ashamed of. These are your lungs. They aren't your character." Augustin Falcone turned his face toward the window, looking at the city glowing to life. A breath left him, only one, and Ruth knew with certainty that it wasn't asthma. She let him have that window. Then, the sound of a key came from outside the door. The door opened, but it wasn't the paramedics. A silver-haired woman entered carrying a leather bag and walked straight past Ruth as though she were passing a chair. She didn't ask who Ruth was. She didn't look at her a second time. She knelt, opened the bag, and everything in her hands was something Ruth had never had enough money to afford. She worked quickly and silently, and while she worked, she spoke to Augie in a voice that held no trace of reverence, the voice of the only person in his life who was allowed to scold him. Then came the sirens. Ruth stood, stepped back, and realized her legs had gone numb from kneeling for so long. The paramedics poured into the room. During the next 15 minutes, not one person there asked her a single question. No one asked her name. No one asked what she had done. The silver-haired woman looked back only once and said, "You please step outside. There was no cruelty in it. It was simply the way people spoke to a piece of furniture when they needed more room." Ruth went into the hallway. She stood there with her back against the wall. She had wiped down with a microfiber cloth the previous Friday morning, and she looked at her hand. The inhaler was still in it. She shook it out of reflex, the same reflex she had followed every morning for years. She held it to her ear, and she heard the faint rattle of what remained. Bruno Castellano arrived at the Tribeca building after the ambulance had gone, and he came up in the service elevator, because that was something he had learned when he was younger than the boy who cleaned the lobby windows. He was 51 years old. He had stood behind 2 Falcone men in his lifetime, and he had learned from the first that the front entrance was meant for people who wanted to be seen. The second was sitting in a chair inside his own study, his tie removed, his collar open, and Bruno knew at once that something had broken inside that room. because in all 34 years of Augustine Falcone's life, he had never allowed anyone to see him with his collar unbuttoned. Bruno stood in the doorway. He didn't ask. He waited, the way he had always waited, and while he waited, he looked at the other man and thought about the thing he thought every time he entered a room with Augie in it. This man didn't wear a watch. He never had. Bruno had given him one many years ago, a beautiful one, and it had remained in a drawer somewhere until this day, because Augustine Falcone didn't need to know what time it was. The meeting began when he arrived. An entire city revolved around that unspoken principle, and Bruno had spent half his life making sure it remained true. "Who?" Bruno finally said. "The cleaner." "What did she see?" "Everything." Bruno stepped inside, closed the door, and did something he hadn't done in many years. He sat down without being invited. "Say that again." "I had an attack. My inhaler didn't work. She gave me hers. 4 puffs. Then she called an ambulance. You let her call." "I didn't let her. I couldn't stop her." Bruno remained silent for a long time, and inside that silence he calculated. He calculated the way he had for 30 years, not in numbers, but in doors and mouths. A medical record bearing the name Falcone was now sitting inside a system. 3 people in uniform had seen this man on the floor, and somewhere there was a woman without a name or a face, riding the subway home to some part of Brooklyn or Queens, with that memory inside her head like an unsigned check. "You know what happens when wolves smell blood, don't you?" Bruno said. Augie didn't answer. "People don't need to know what illness you have. They only need to know you have one. For 30 years, I've kept this name from showing a single crack, not because I love you, but because the day people see the first crack is the day everything else becomes possible. Do you understand? It isn't the crack that kills you. It's the idea that you can crack." Bruno pointed toward the table. "And now someone knows. Someone who isn't one of ours. Someone whose name I don't even know," Ruth, Augie said. Bruno stopped. "You asked her name? No. I read it on her uniform." Bruno closed his eyes. "Listen to me. There are 3 things this organization doesn't touch, and your father told me that the very night he brought me in. No drugs, no women, no children. Not because he was a saint, because those are the 3 things that make people pick up the phone and call the federal government. He told me, Bruno, if you want to sleep peacefully, don't take away the one thing whose loss will leave a person with nothing left to lose." I remember those words every day. But this woman, she doesn't fall into any of those 3 categories. She is a problem. She gave me her brother's medication, Augie said. Bruno opened his eyes. "How do you know?" "There was a name on the label. It wasn't hers. It belonged to a boy." Bruno looked at him for a long time. He was a practical man. He had survived as long as he had because he had never confused a good story with the truth. And what he had just heard was a good story, and good stories were the things that got people killed. "So what?" Bruno said. "What do you think that means? That she's a good person?" "Augie, I've seen people sell their own blood for far less than that." He stood, straightened the front of his coat, and said the words on his way toward the door without looking back, in the voice of a man stating something so obvious that it wasn't worth emphasizing. "Hungry people will sell anything." The door closed. Augustine Falcone sat alone in the room that had been cleaned spotless, and on the tabletop, placed neatly parallel to the edge, lay an empty plastic inhaler that someone had carefully set there. Raymond DeLuca arrived the following evening, and he came through the front entrance, because Raymond DeLuca had never once in his life had a reason to use the back door. He carried a cardboard box tied with string, the kind of box everyone in Bensonhurst could recognize from a distance, and he set it on the kitchen table with both hands, carefully, as though he were putting down something that might break. "From the corner of 18th Street, he said. "She's still making them. She's in her 80s now. I asked her to save some of the thin crust ones for me." "You don't like the thick crust," I remembered. He wore thin framed glasses, the kind that made a man look like an accountant or a schoolteacher, and he took off his coat and draped it over the back of a chair, the way people only did inside the home of someone they considered family. He was 39 years old. He was the son of Augie's father's younger sister, and in another version of another story, he would have been the man sitting in the chair at the head of the table. No one in the family had ever said that aloud. Everyone knew it. "I heard," Raymond said, still facing away as he untied the string around the box. "Bruno called me at midnight. He said you were tired." He turned around, and there was nothing on his face but warmth. "Are you tired?" "I'm fine, all right." Raymond nodded and accepted the answer immediately. without asking another question, and that was what made people love him. Raymond DeLuca never asked twice. He allowed people to keep their lies exactly as they had told them, and they thanked him for it. And then one night, 3 months later, they told him everything. Saul's daughter over in Ozone Park had the baby, he said, pushing the box toward Ogie. A boy. I already sent flowers. I signed your name, thank you. And Thursday is Bruno's daughter's birthday. The older one. I took care of that too. He sat down, and he sat the way a man sat in his own kitchen, with one elbow resting on the table, and he continued in that same steady voice. Do you remember when we stayed at Grandma's house? That summer when you couldn't leave the room. You were 10. She made me sit there and watch you. I hated it. The other boys were outside playing ball, and I was stuck in that room with you, hot as an oven, and that machine blowing mist. Augie said nothing. I still remember the sound that machine made, Raymond said. Hiss, hiss, hiss. All night long, he laughed. You remember it too, don't you? I remember. Well then, he tapped the tabletop lightly twice, bringing the story to an end, and he didn't say another word about it. That single gesture contained everything that Raymond DeLuca was. He had just reminded the most powerful man in New York that there was still one person in the world who had known him before he became a name, and then he set the memory down before it had time to become a burden. He had been doing that for 20 years. For 20 years, he had been the one who took care of everything, and everything meant everything. Flowers for weddings, envelopes for funerals, lawyers for foolish nephews, and the prescription renewal every quarter that only 3 people in the world knew existed. No one had assigned him that responsibility. It had simply flowed toward him, the way water flowed toward low ground, because Raymond DeLuca was the only man who never asked why. Call me if you need anything, he said, standing and putting his coat back on. Any hour. You know that. I know. Raymond paused at the door. He looked around the apartment, 4 bedrooms, a refrigerator with almost nothing inside it, a coffee table without a single stain, and for 1 second, something passed across his face that no one could catch, not even the man watching him. You should eat the pastry, he said. She made it for you. Then he left. Down in the lobby, he stepped out of the elevator, nodded to the doorman, called him by name, and asked how his knee was doing. He didn't drive himself. Someone was waiting for him outside with the engine running, and he climbed into the back seat, the door closed, and the car disappeared into the stream of red lights moving along the street. On the 32nd floor, Augustin Falcone opened the box, ate 1 pastry, and sat there alone for a very long time. Ruth reached Greenpoint after dark, and she heard her brother before she saw him, the sound of a pencil racing across paper so quickly that it sounded like someone scratching at a wall. Pete sat at the kitchen table, his legs swinging because his feet still didn't reach the floor, his glasses slipping down his nose, the airplane sticker he had placed on the frame himself peeling at one corner since summer, though he wouldn't let anyone remove it. Ruth, the boy said without looking up, do you know what this is? An airplane. It isn't just an airplane. It's a cargo plane. A cargo plane has to have a big belly. Mr. Ellis said the ones with big bellies carry things, and the ones with small bellies carry people. I made the belly really big, it certainly is. I drew an elephant inside. Ruth took off her coat, hung it on the hook, and stood there looking at her brother's tangled hair as his head bent over the sheet of paper, allowing that moment to last for 1 more beat. There are elephants on airplanes? People really do fly elephants, Ruth. Mr. Ellis said they do. They carry elephants from one place to another. We just don't see it. Mr. Ellis knows a lot. Mr. Ellis knows everything. Ruth laughed. It was a real laugh, not the one she wore on her face throughout every shift, and it made her tired in a different way, a pleasant way. She reheated the pot of soup on the stove, listened as he told her about a boy named Marcus, who had traded him a pencil sharpener for half a cookie, and how it had been an excellent deal, asked questions in all the right places, and murmured agreement whenever she was supposed to. She let him talk until he ran out of things to say on his own. Then she washed the dishes, wiped the table, and when Pete was asleep, she went into the bathroom and closed the door. She took the inhaler from the pocket of her apron. She shook it beside her ear. She had made that motion so many times that her hand knew before her ear did, and her hand already knew while she was still standing in the hallway on the 32nd floor. But she shook it anyway, listening for the count of 5. She sat on the edge of the bathtub, 5 puffs. She did the arithmetic she had been doing all her life, the kind of arithmetic no school ever taught, the arithmetic of someone counting backward from a small number toward nothing. There were still 2 weeks before the name on the prescription could be approved again. A 11-year-old child. Cold weather on its way. 5 puffs. She didn't regret it. That was what she would remember most clearly later, that she sat on the edge of that bathtub and searched inside herself for even the smallest trace of regret, and she couldn't find one. Had she been taken back to that room, she would have done exactly the same thing. She knew that as surely as she knew her own name. What she found wasn't regret. It was fear. The fear sat in her stomach like a stone swallowed by mistake, not sharp, not painful, only heavy, and it spoke to her in a very calm voice, telling her that 5 puffs weren't a plan. 5 puffs were a prayer. She stood. She turned the hot water on as far as it would go, closed the drain, and sat on the tiled floor with her back against the door. Steam crept over the mirror, crept across the ceiling, and she breathed it in, shallow breaths, 4 counts in, 6 counts out, the technique that didn't cost a penny, and that her mother had taught her in this very bathroom, in this very spot, back when her mother used to teach her things like that. She sat there until her chest opened. She didn't touch the inhaler. Then she went outside and did the final thing she did each day. She opened the kitchen drawer, the second one from the top, the drawer anyone entering the apartment would assume was meant for odds and ends. Inside were rubber bands, old batteries that might not be dead yet, and a single sock she believed would someday be reunited with its missing partner. Ruth Sawicki didn't throw away anything that could still be used. She had never possessed enough to do that. She placed the nearly empty inhaler inside, beside an envelope yellowed at the corners, an envelope she didn't open, didn't read, didn't look at, but simply never threw away. Then she closed the drawer. 3 days later, Ruth Sawicki sat on a blue plastic chair in the hallway on the 3rd floor of the hospital, and she was still wearing rubber gloves. She didn't remember running. She remembered the sound of the phone, ringing in the middle of her shift, and she remembered leaving her cleaning cart in the middle of the hallway, on the 11th floor of another building, its door open, the vacuum cleaner still plugged in, and she remembered someone calling her name from behind, but she hadn't turned around. The rest was gone. The rest was a blank space, and inside that blank space was a pair of yellow rubber gloves still clinging tightly to her hands, one of them torn at the index finger, so she had turned it inside out before putting it on, and she sat there staring down at them as though they belonged to someone else. The hospital hallway carried a smell she knew. It wasn't the smell of medicine. It was the smell of industrial floor cleaner, the kind diluted according to the ratio printed on the container, and she recognized it before she even came through the doors, because she had used that exact kind for years. There was a janitorial closet at the end of the hallway. Its door didn't close all the way. She noticed. She always noticed. There was a clock on the wall, and she didn't look at it once. People walked back and forth. Someone was eating a sandwich in the waiting room, and the smell of bread made her nauseous. She sat perfectly straight, both hands resting on her knees, and she didn't speak to anyone, and she didn't cry, because she was holding herself together, and people could only hold themselves together when they didn't move. There was only one sentence circling through her mind. 4 puffs. 4 puffs. 4 puffs. Then the door opened and a nurse stepped out, and before she could say anything, Ruth had already read the answer on her face, because Ruth had spent her entire life reading people's faces, and that face was tired, but it wasn't carrying bad news. "Your brother is all right," the nurse said. "He's breathing well. We're going to keep him overnight just to be safe." "But he's all right," Ruth nodded. She wanted to say thank you, but her throat wouldn't open. "And," the nurse added, smiling this time, "he's asking for chocolate pudding. He's asked 3 times already. He said they have vanilla pudding across the hall, but he doesn't like vanilla." "You can go in now," Ruth stood. Her legs were numb. She entered the room, and there, sitting upright against the pillows on a bed, far too large for him, was Pete, holding a plastic spoon, his pudding cup more than half empty, chocolate smeared at the corner of his mouth. The boy saw her, and his eyes lit up. "Ruth," he said with his mouth full. "Guess what? What? The ambulance has blue lights too. Not just red ones. Blue and red, and they spin around. I thought they only had red lights. Everyone thinks they only have red lights." "Yeah," I asked the driver. He said the blue ones are so people can see them at night. Red works better during the day. Blue works better at night. He scooped up another spoonful. His name was Danny. Ruth sat on the edge of the bed. At last she pulled off the gloves and placed them in her lap, then reached out and smoothed his tangled hair. He hated having it touched in front of strangers there. "Is it good?" she asked. "It's good. Do you want some?" "I saved a few spoonfuls for you. I already ate." Pete nodded, accepting the answer, and scraped the inside of the cup with his spoon for a while. Then he looked up and asked in the same voice he used when asking about airplanes carrying elephants. A voice of pure curiosity with not a single grain of blame in it. The voice of a child asking because he truly wanted to know. "Ruth," he said, "who did you give my medicine to?" Ruth didn't blink. Something inside her chest fell very deep and for a very long time, and it never reached the bottom. She smiled. She smiled convincingly. She had been practicing that for 10 years, and she was very good at it. "I dropped it at work," she said. "I'm so clumsy. I'll get a new one tomorrow. You really are silly," he laughed. Ruth laughed with him. She sat beside him until he fell asleep. Then she stepped back into the hallway and walked toward the far end, to the door that didn't close properly, and pushed it open. Ruth stood looking inside the small utility space for a long while, staring at the container of floor cleaner whose name she knew, the mop propped upside down so it could drain properly, the bucket with one broken wheel, and she thought, the people here do their work carefully. Then she closed the door and went down to the first floor, because someone at the desk had called her name twice over the loudspeaker. The woman behind the admissions counter was very kind. That was what Ruth would remember. She spoke slowly, explained every box, and had a photograph of a cat taped to the corner of her computer screen. She handed Ruth a stack of papers and a ballpoint pen attached to the counter by a chain, and she said, "Just sign wherever you see an X, but please read everything else carefully." And Ruth said yes. She turned a page, she signed. She turned another page, she signed. Then she reached the page with the number on it. It sat in the lower right corner, inside a small box printed in black ink, in the same size type as everything else on the page. It wasn't bold. No one had printed it in bold. It simply sat there, calmly, among the lines about insurance codes and service codes, and Ruth stared at it, and for about a second and a half, she didn't understand what she was looking at, the way people sometimes stare at a word in a language they know, and suddenly see it fall apart into meaningless letters. Then she understood. She set the pen down. She didn't say anything. The woman behind the counter asked whether she was all right, and Ruth heard her own voice say, "Yes, I'm fine. I'm just finishing the signatures." And her hand continued signing. The signature still steady, still neat. The signature she had practiced when she was 17. So she would look like an adult on papers no 17-year-old should ever have been required to sign. She handed the forms back. She thanked the woman. She said thank you so much, and she meant it. And the woman smiled and said she hoped Ruth's brother would recover quickly. Then Ruth left. She walked through the waiting room, past the water dispenser, past a wall covered in pamphlets that she passed as though it were nothing but a wall, and she pushed open the door to the women's restroom and locked it behind her. Then she collapsed. It wasn't like it was in the movies. There were no loud sobs. Ruth Sawicki slid down the door until she was sitting on the tiled floor, and the first thing that broke was her jaw. She heard her teeth strike together, then her shoulders gave way. Then she folded over her knees and pressed both hands to her mouth and cried like someone trying not to disturb anyone. 10 years came out of her in the time it took 4 songs to play. She cried for the sheet of paper with the number on it. She cried for the inhaler in the kitchen drawer. She cried for an October afternoon when she was 17, when she had stood in the kitchen with an envelope in her hand and listened to her mother coughing in the next room, and had done something she hadn't told a single person in the world about for 10 years. She cried because she had grown up and become a 27-year-old woman sitting on the floor of a hospital restroom, and she wasn't any better than her mother had been, and perhaps no one in this family had ever managed to become better. Perhaps that was what they passed down to one another instead of money. She cried because her brother had asked her a question, and she had lied, and she would lie again. Then she stopped. She stopped the way someone turned off a faucet. She sat there a little longer, breathing 4 counts in, 6 counts out, and stared at the tiles between her feet and counted them, because counting was easy. She stood. She turned on the cold water and washed her face, twice, 3 times, the water so cold that it hurt her skin. She looked into the mirror and saw that face, red eyes, red nose, and she knew it would fade within 15 minutes if she stood beneath the hallway light at the right angle. She removed the orange hair tie. With wet fingers, she smoothed her hair back, pulling it neat, pulling it tight, and tied it again. She checked her collar. She took a paper towel and wiped up the water she herself had dripped onto the floor. Then she opened the door, went back up to the 3rd floor, and pushed open the door to her brother's room. Pete was awake. He looked at her. "Ruth," he said. "I'm fine," Ruth said. The woman named Judith Amsel called first, and that was the first thing that told Ruth she wasn't a bad person, because bad people didn't call ahead. She came on a Wednesday afternoon, 55 years old, wearing a gray sweater and carrying a leather briefcase worn at the corners, and she asked permission before sitting down in a chair in the Greenpoint kitchen. She declined coffee. Then she reconsidered and said, "All right, just a little thank you," and Ruth understood she did it to give her hands something to do. Judith Amsel had sat in many kitchens. "I'm going to be direct," she said. "A case has been opened. This isn't an accusation. I haven't come to take anything away from you. But once a case is opened, it has to go through its entire process, and I'm the person who carries it through that process, which means I'll be sitting in this chair a few more times. I wanted you to hear that from me instead of from a sheet of paper." She opened her briefcase. She handed Ruth a document. Ruth took it. She had read everything all her life. She read bottle labels, the small print at the bottom of bills, the ingredients on cereal boxes while she waited for water to boil. She was someone who read. But she held that paper, and her eyes moved over the lines, and not one of them stayed inside her mind. They were written in English. She knew every word. She could spell them. It was only that when they were put together, they described some woman, some apartment, and some child, and Ruth sat inside her own apartment, across from the table where her brother drew airplanes carrying elephants, and she didn't recognize anyone in those pages. She turned to the back. It was the same. Someone had taken her life, fed it into a machine, and the machine had produced this, and this was far neater than her life had ever been. It had sections, it had headings, it fit neatly onto both sides of 2 sheets of paper. Ruth thought, "I spent 10 years living this, and they wrapped it up in 2 pages. She set the document on the table. She smoothed it flat with her palm once, out of habit, the habit of someone who was always making every surface level again. "You don't have to say anything today," Judith said. "Truly. I know people see something like this and immediately want to explain, but explanations don't help. I come, I sit, I take notes, and then I leave. You just keep living your life. What did I do wrong?" Ruth asked. Judith Amsel looked at her, and there was something in her eyes that Ruth would think about often afterward. The weariness of someone who had answered that question so many times that no answer sounded right anymore. "Are you asking me, or are you asking the paper?" "I'm asking you." "Then you're asking the wrong person," she said. "I didn't write it." From the living room came the sound of a pencil scraping rapidly across paper. Pete didn't know there was a stranger in the apartment, or perhaps he knew and didn't care because he was busy with an airplane. Judith heard the sound. She didn't turn her head. "Does he draw?" "All day." "Good," she said. And she drank her coffee, and she said nothing more about it. Afterward, she began gathering her things. She stacked the papers, closed the briefcase, fastened the clasp, and while she made those small movements, she said something in the same voice people used to speak about the weather, something casual, something she let fall, because she had sat in many kitchens and knew what was worth saying and what wasn't. "You know," she said, "this didn't come from the hospital in the usual way. Normally, it follows a different route. In this case, someone asked about the boy's records." Ruth looked up. "Who? I don't know. The paperwork doesn't say." Judith stood and lifted the strap of her bag onto her shoulder. "A stranger." That triggered one switch, then that switch triggered another, and eventually I ended up sitting here. "It's only machinery." She walked toward the door. She stopped, turned back to look at Ruth, and said, "Leave that paper where it is. Don't read it again. People read these things over and over, and then they start believing them." Then she left. Ruth stood in the kitchen for a long time. She didn't read the paper again. She stood there with 3 words resting motionless in her mind, unconnected to anything, with nowhere to put them. Someone had asked. She washed Judith Amsel's cup, dried it, and placed it upside down inside the cabinet. No one fired Ruth Sawicki. That was the detail no one would believe later, when she tried to tell this story to someone. People always wanted there to be a person who had dismissed her. They wanted a fat man behind a desk, a cruel sentence, a door slammed shut, because then the story would have somewhere to place its anger. But there was no one. What happened was this. Pete's doctor said he needed further monitoring, 3 appointments over the course of 2 weeks, and those appointments fell in the middle of the morning. Because everything in this world fell in the middle of the morning. Because the world had been designed for people who could leave in the middle of the morning. Ruth called the scheduling coordinator. Her name was Denise, and Denise wasn't annoyed at all. Denise said, "It's all right, Ruth. Go take care of it. I'll put someone else on your shift." She meant exactly that. There was no sarcasm. There was no warning. Denise was a kind person doing her job properly, and Denise's job was to fill empty spaces. And once an empty space had been filled, it wasn't empty anymore. Ruth was paid by the hour. When she didn't go in, she didn't have hours. No one took anything away from her. They simply didn't give her what she hadn't come to receive. The first time, she lost a morning. The second time, she lost a morning, and the afternoon shift that went with it, because getting back from the hospital in time for an afternoon shift required a car, and Ruth took the train. The third time, Denise called her first, and her voice was still kind, and she said, "Ruth, would it be all right if I put you on evening shifts next week, because the morning crews have already gotten used to working with someone else?" Ruth said yes. She said yes, and she thanked her, and she ended the call, and she stood in the kitchen and understood that what had just happened wasn't a blow. It was a seat someone else had taken while she was out of the room. She had made the right choice. She knew that. Had she been given the choice again, she still would have gone to all 3 appointments. But there was something no one had told her when she was 17. That there were places in this world where doing the right thing still meant losing. Not because anyone was cruel, but because the scale had been set that way before she was born. Then the phone rang on Thursday evening. An unfamiliar number. Ruth knew what unfamiliar numbers meant. She watched it ring. She had watched it ring many times before, and that was one of the things she hated most about herself, standing in her own kitchen and hiding from a telephone. This time she answered. "Hello, may I speak with Ms. Ruth Sawicki? Please?" The voice was young. The voice was pleasant. "My name is Fitzgerald, and I'm calling from the collections department. This call may be recorded. Is this a convenient time for you to speak?" Ruth said yes. Then Fitzgerald did Fitzgerald's job, and he did it very well, so well that Ruth had to give him credit for it. He didn't threaten her. He didn't raise his voice. He called her Miss Sawicki every time he spoke. He said, "I understand," 3 times. He asked whether she would like to hear about the available options, and he read the options aloud, and every option was a door leading into the same room. He asked how much she could pay that month. Ruth gave him a number. There was a brief silence, and inside that silence Ruth heard the sound of a keyboard, and she knew she had just been entered into a box. Then Fitzgerald said, "Thank you for your cooperation. I've made a note of that," and he wished her a pleasant evening, and he meant it sincerely. Ruth ended the call. She stood there. That man, Denise. The woman behind the counter with the photograph of the cat, Judith Amsel. Every one of them was kind. Every one of them was doing the right thing, and Ruth Sawicki was drowning. And there wasn't a single person in the world she could be angry with. That was what exhausted her. It wasn't cruelty. It was politeness. She heard small footsteps behind her. Pete stood in the kitchen doorway, holding his sketchbook against his chest, his glasses slipping down his nose. He looked at her for a moment, the way he always did, and he asked the question he always asked, the question he had been asking since before he knew how to read. "Can you breathe?" Ruth opened her mouth. And for the first time in 10 years, she told the truth. "No." The 3rd of the month arrived, as it always did, and Ruth walked to the pharmacy on the corner at 7 o'clock in the morning, because at 7 o'clock there was no line. She had been going to that pharmacy since her mother was still alive. It had a bell above the door that no one ever bothered to repair, a rotating rack filled with sunglasses she had never seen anyone buy, and an Indian man behind the counter who had called her Miss Sawicki, since she was a 17-year-old girl standing there with a piece of paper in her hand, not understanding what she was supposed to do. He handed her the paper bag. He asked how the boy was doing. Ruth said he was all right now. "Thank you." And she thanked him once more, because she always said thank you twice in that place. She stepped outside. It was cold. She stood on the sidewalk and opened the paper bag, not for any particular reason, only because her hands always wanted to check whatever she had just been given. Because once they had handed her the wrong thing, and she had been forced to walk 20 minutes back. She took out the inhaler. It was new. The label still carried the faint smell of fresh ink and paper. Her brother's name was printed there in capital letters, and she looked at it for a second the way she always did, because seeing her brother's name on a prescription was the thing that kept both of them breathing, and she had never stopped finding that strange. Then her eyes moved lower, down the label, past the dosage instructions, past the expiration date, down to the tiny line near the bottom, the line no one in the world ever read. She read it because she was someone who read, because she had read everything all her life, and she had read that line on every inhaler her brother had used for years, and it had never meant anything. It had only been a row of letters and numbers her eyes passed over. The way they passed over a stain on a wall, she read it. And she stood frozen in the middle of the sidewalk on Manhattan Avenue in Greenpoint. Someone pushing a stroller went around her. A bus stopped and pulled away again. Someone apologized for bumping her shoulder, and Ruth didn't hear. She stood there with the inhaler in her hand, and inside her mind was a sequence of letters and numbers, and she had seen that sequence somewhere else. She saw it beneath the light of a study on the 32nd floor. She saw it lying in her palm on an empty inhaler she had picked up from the carpet, because her hand had moved before her mind could ask why. Ruth didn't run. Later she would wonder why she hadn't run. She walked home at her usual pace, the same rhythm she always used, and all the way there she told herself she remembered it wrong, that all those strings of numbers looked alike, that this was the most common medication in America, and there were millions of identical inhalers, sitting on millions of shelves, that she was a 27-year-old cleaner imagining things. She told herself that for 4 blocks. She still didn't believe it. She opened the apartment door. Pete was still asleep. She went into the kitchen and pulled open the second drawer from the top, and amid the rustling of rubber bands, old batteries, and a single unmatched sock, she found it. The empty inhaler. She had carried it home from the 32nd floor that night, because she hadn't been thinking, because it had still been in her hand when they told her to leave the room, because Ruth Sawicki didn't throw anything away, not even something empty, not even something that didn't belong to her. She placed the 2 inhalers side by side on the kitchen table beneath the fluorescent light. One was new, bearing her brother's name. The other was empty, with no name at all. She bent down. She read the tiny line on the first one. She read the tiny line on the second, the same sequence, every letter, every number. Ruth Sawicki stood in her kitchen in Greenpoint, empty-handed, her hair not yet tied back, her bare feet on the cold floor. And she was holding something 400 armed men had failed to see. Something a man who didn't wear a watch had failed to see. Something an entire city had failed to see. Because none of them had ever read that line. Ruth Sawicki didn't have a college degree. She didn't know how to search a database. She didn't know anyone in the industry, and she didn't have a single friend who could explain any of this to her. What she had was the cardboard box. It sat on the kitchen table, the box people tore open and threw away, the box no one in the world ever kept. Ruth kept everything. She turned it over in her hands, rotated it beneath the fluorescent light, and on the back, at the very bottom, printed in letters so small that she had to tilt the box until the light fell across it at an angle, there was a line of text and a string of numbers. If you have questions about this product, please call. She stared at it. She thought, how many years has this been printed here? She thought, how many boxes like this have I held in my life? She thought, so they put it right there where anyone could see it, and no one ever calls. She called. There was hold music. The hold music was a piano piece that sounded as though it belonged in a hotel elevator. A recorded voice told her to press 1 for English. Another recorded voice told her the call might be recorded to improve the quality of service. Ruth stood in the kitchen, with her cracked screen phone wedged between her shoulder and her ear, washing dishes while she waited because she didn't know how to stand still. Then someone answered. A woman. Her voice was even, professional, slightly tired, the voice of someone who had repeated the same greeting 400 times that week. Yes, how may I help you? Ruth said she wanted to ask about a batch. She read the number. She read it slowly, 1 character at a time, then repeated it when the woman asked her to read it again. There was the sound of a keyboard. Then there was silence. That silence lasted longer than an ordinary silence. Ruth heard it stretching, heard its nature change, and she set the bowl down in the sink and stood upright. Are you holding this product in your hand right now? The woman asked. Her voice had changed. The weariness was gone. Yes, where did you purchase it? A pharmacy. In Brooklyn. May I have the name and address of the pharmacy, please? And don't use it again. Stop using it immediately. Ruth could hear her heart beating in her ears. Why? The woman was silent for another beat, and Ruth understood that she was reading something on the screen, deciding how much she was permitted to say. Then she spoke. That number didn't belong to the company. It never had. It was an overprinted number, stamped onto a genuine casing, with a genuine label, packed inside a genuine box, and inside there was propellant and nothing else. It wasn't defective medication. It wasn't medication. It was a device that released air. Did you read it on the casing? The woman asked. There was something in her voice Ruth couldn't name. Yes, not many people read that. Ruth thanked her. She thanked her twice. She ended the call. And she stood in her kitchen, her hands still wet with soap, and understood two things at the same time. And those two things didn't come to her in order, but overlapped like two shadows. The first thing. The man on the floor of the 32nd floor had pressed his inhaler, then pressed it again, and nothing had happened, and he had believed his body was betraying him, and he had sat there waiting to die in the shame of a man who believed his own lungs were the enemy, while all that time the device in his hand had only been pumping out air. The second thing came half a second later. Ruth turned her head toward the bedroom. The door was partly closed. Inside, a 11-year-old child was sleeping with his glasses resting on the table beside the bed, the glasses with the airplane sticker peeling at one corner. And Ruth Sawicki stood there and counted backward. She counted backward through the inhalers. She counted backward through the nights her brother had sat on the bathroom floor surrounded by steam, while she had blamed the weather. She counted backward through the month. She had blamed herself for giving away 4 puffs. The month she had sat on the edge of the bathtub and done the arithmetic of 5 puffs and believed the fault was hers. It wasn't those 4 puffs. It had never been those 4 puffs. She reached out and gripped the edge of the kitchen table. The empty inhaler and the new one still lay side by side beneath the light, and Ruth looked at them. And for the first time in her life, what rose inside her wasn't fear. Then a question came, and it came at 3 o'clock in the morning, the hour when every real question comes. Ruth lay in bed with her eyes open, staring at the crack in the ceiling shaped like a river, the crack she had looked at for 10 years, and she was thinking about the inhaler that released nothing but air, and then she suddenly sat upright. If his inhaler was only air, and Pete's new inhaler was only air too, then what was the inhaler she had pulled from the pocket of her apron on the 32nd floor? She got out of bed. She didn't turn on the bedroom light. She walked barefoot through the living room, switched on only the fluorescent light in the kitchen, pulled open the second drawer from the top, and searched through it. Rubber bands, batteries, a single unmatched sock, a roll of tape that was almost gone, the lid from a jar that had broken so long ago she could no longer remember when. And at the very bottom, beneath everything else, was the inhaler she had placed there. On the night she sat on the edge of the bathtub and counted 5. She took it out. She set it on the table beside the other 2. And now there were 3 inhalers lying beneath the fluorescent light in the Greenpoint kitchen. She bent down. She read the tiny line of print. It was different. It wasn't the same sequence. Not a single character matched. This inhaler had been prescribed several seasons earlier, before even the summer that had just passed, before the other kind began flowing into the pharmacy with the broken doorbell on the corner. Ruth remembered the day she brought it home. She remembered because she remembered everything. It had been nearly empty for a long time, and one evening she had picked it up to throw it into the trash, but she had stopped, shaken it beside her ear, and heard that something was still inside, so she had put it in the drawer. She stood in the kitchen at 3 o'clock in the morning, staring at those 3 inhalers, and she understood. The inhaler she had given that man wasn't a new one. It was the inhaler that should have been thrown away long ago. It was the inhaler anyone with enough money to buy. The next one would have dropped into the trash months earlier without thinking, without shaking it, without holding it to an ear, simply lifting the lid and letting go. It had still been inside the pocket of her apron on that Tuesday morning, because Ruth Sawicki had never once in her life possessed enough to throw away anything that might still have the smallest amount left inside. She sat down in the chair. She sat there for a very long time. Then she laughed once, a short sound, and it wasn't a joyful laugh. It was the sound that escaped a person when she looked directly at a truth too enormous to fit anywhere else. She spoke aloud in the empty kitchen, to no one. "If I'd been rich, you would've died." She heard her own voice in the kitchen. "Rich people throw away what's left." Ruth sat there until the light outside the window began to change. She thought about that man, about the 4 bedrooms he didn't sleep in, about the refrigerator with nothing inside except water and medicine, about the coffee table without a single stain because no one had ever placed anything on it. She had cleaned that apartment for 2 years, and she had never seen anything partly used inside his home. There was no shampoo bottle with a quarter left. There was no opened box of pastries. Nothing was old. Everything in that home was either new or didn't exist, and Ruth had once believed that was what luxury looked like. But now she sat in her own kitchen and understood that it was a way of living that would have killed him on his own carpet if he had lived that way for one more day on that morning. People had waited 20 years to hear that Augustin Falcone couldn't breathe. They hadn't been able to kill him with guns. What had nearly killed him was something sitting on a pharmacy shelf, costing $9, in a neighborhood no one bothered to inspect. And what saved him was a cleaning woman who didn't have enough money to buy the next inhaler. Ruth stood. She took all 3 inhalers, took the cardboard box, wrapped them inside a plastic bag, and tied it shut. Outside, Greenpoint was slowly brightening. She stood at the window and looked down at the street. And she knew that somewhere on the island across the river, there was a man who didn't wear a watch. And he had no idea what he owed or whom he owed it to. The offices of Falcone Sanitation stood in an industrial district at the water's edge, and they looked nothing like anything Ruth had ever imagined. It was a low brick building with a faded sign, a parking lot full of puddles, and the smell of diesel and river water hanging in the air. Outside, 3 green trucks sat with their engines running. Inside, there was a reception counter, with a fake plant and a wall calendar from a tire company. Ruth stood there in her coat, the same coat she had worn through 4 winters, and she realized that this was a real workplace, that people truly collected garbage here, and that thought sent a colder shiver down her spine than it would have if the place had looked like something from a movie. Bruno Castellano came out. He didn't ask who she was. He looked her over once, from her shoes to her hair, and Ruth saw the exact moment he placed her inside some compartment in his mind and closed it. "You've come to the wrong place," he said. He said it kindly. That was what made it worse. "I need to see him. Do you have an appointment?" "No." "Then you don't need to see him." Ruth didn't move. She had stood before many doors in her life, and she understood the law of them. The law that the person standing at the door wasn't her enemy. The person standing at the door was simply the door itself. "Tell him the cleaning woman wants to talk about a batch number." Bruno stopped. Something very small crossed his face, and Ruth caught it because she caught everything. He didn't know what batch number meant, but he knew what cleaning woman meant. He stood there looking at her for one more beat, and there was something in that look she would later understand as calculation. The arithmetic of a man weighing what he might lose by letting her in against what he might lose by refusing. Then he turned away. Ruth waited in the room with the fake plant. She didn't sit. She looked at the tire company calendar and thought, no one has torn off this month's page yet. When the door opened, she entered a room smaller than she had expected. There was a metal desk. There were several filing cabinets. There was a window overlooking the parking lot. Nothing in that room suggested that it belonged to the most powerful man in New York, except for the man himself, sitting behind the metal desk in a suit worth more than the apartment she rented. He didn't stand. He looked at her, and Ruth saw that he was searching her face for the same thing she had seen while he lay on the floor that day. A witness. "What do you want?" he asked. Ruth reached into the pocket of her coat. She felt Bruno move behind her, and she thought, so this is how it is. This is how people live like this. She withdrew her hand very slowly. She placed 2 plastic inhalers on the metal desk. They rolled slightly, then stopped. "This one is yours," she said. "This one belongs to my brother. Bought last week at the pharmacy on the corner near my home." $9. Augustin Falcone looked at the 2 inhalers. He didn't touch them. Read the line at the bottom. He didn't move. "You've never read it, have you?" Then he bent down. Ruth watched him read. She watched his eyes move across the sequence of characters on the first inhaler, then across the second, then back to the first, and then she watched him read them a 3rd time, and she knew the exact second he finished because his entire body became perfectly still, the stillness of a glass that had just fallen from the edge of a table, but hadn't yet struck the floor. "They're empty," Ruth said. "Both of them. There's nothing inside." I called the number printed on the box. They told me to stop using it immediately. They asked where I bought it, and the woman's voice was shaking. Silence. Ruth stood there and let the silence do its work. Bruno said something behind her, a short sentence, but Augie raised one hand and Bruno fell quiet. The man stared at the two inhalers. Then he did something Ruth would remember for the rest of her life. He lifted his head and he didn't look at her. He looked through her, toward the window overlooking the parking lot, and his face didn't change in the slightest, not even a little, and inside that absence of change, something died. Because Augustin Falcone had just asked himself one very simple question. In 20 years, how many people in the world had been able to touch his inhaler before it reached his hands? The answer was one. He didn't invite her to stay. He stood, walked past her, pushed open a steel door at the end of the hallway, and stepped outside, and Ruth understood that this was how that man extended an invitation. The fire escape ran along the back of the brick building, and the wind off the water cut cold, the kind of November wind that carried the smell of salt and oil. Augie sat down on the top step. Ruth sat on the step below, leaving between them the length of a mop, the distance she had chosen the first time and had never changed. The two of them sat there, and neither spoke, and the cold wind entered both their lungs, and both of them had to breathe shallowly, and that was the only thing in the world they shared. "Have you eaten?" he asked. "Yes, you're lying, yes." He didn't press her. He sat looking at the parking lot below, at the puddles reflecting the lights, and he let the real question rest a while longer, the way someone lets a hot glass cool before picking it up. Then he spoke. "I'm going to ask you something. Whether you answer is your choice. Go ahead." There was a name on the inhaler. It wasn't yours. The wind passed over them. "Why?" he said. "Why did you give me the boy's medicine?" Ruth sat in silence for a long time. She looked down at her hands, at the cracked skin across her knuckles, and she thought she would give him the answer people always gave, that she hadn't been thinking, that anyone would have done the same. It was the safe answer. She had already repeated it to herself many times. "Because I once had an envelope," she said. He said nothing. "I was 17. My mother was coughing. She had been coughing since spring, and I told her it was the dust, because she worked at the factory, because the air was dry. She believed me. She believed me because she wanted to, and because I was the only child still at home, and when a person has only one child left, they believe that child." Ruth heard how steady her voice was, and even she was surprised. Then an envelope came, from the hospital, an appointment. I stood in the kitchen holding it, and I knew what that appointment meant. It meant another piece of paper would come after it, and then another, and we didn't have insurance, and I was 17 years old. Trying to figure out what we were going to use to pay the rent that month, she stopped. The cold wind entered her, and she breathed out slowly. I didn't give her the envelope. I hid it in the kitchen drawer. I thought that if she didn't know, then she wasn't sick. I was 17, and that was what I believed. 3 weeks later, she couldn't climb the stairs anymore, and by then it didn't matter whether the envelope existed or not. She looked out over the parking lot. They told me 3 weeks wouldn't have changed anything. The doctor said so. Everyone said so. She gave the smallest shrug. "I don't know. I'll never know." Augie didn't move. "The envelope is still in there," she said. "The same one where I kept the inhaler I gave you. I haven't opened it. A decade has passed, and I haven't opened it, and I haven't thrown it away." Then she turned her head and looked directly at him, and she said the words she had never spoken to anyone in the world. "So don't thank me. I didn't save you because I'm good. I saw a man reaching for something he needed and unable to reach it, and I had seen that before, and the first time I stood still. I saved you because once I didn't save someone." Silence. Ruth waited. She had waited 10 years to hear someone tell her that it was all right, that she had been young, that she hadn't known. She had imagined those words, and she had been afraid of them because she knew she wouldn't believe them. Augustin Falcone didn't say them. He sat looking at the city on the far shore, and he let her words remain exactly where she had placed them, without touching them, without wiping them away, without correcting them. Then he said, "Then we're alike." The wind blew. "I'm paying a debt to someone who died too," he said. "I pay it with steel and concrete and 400 men, and I've been paying it for 7 years. And she's still dead." He stood. "Go home. It's late." Ruth didn't go home. She made it down 3 steps before turning back, because she had seen his face when he stood, and she had spent her entire life reading people's faces, and that face was heading somewhere. She returned to the room with the metal desk and found Bruno standing beside it with his coat already on and his keys in his hand, and she understood at once that people in this place didn't need to speak to one another, they only needed to put on their coats. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "Go home. What are you going to do?" Augie looked at her, and he didn't answer, and the absence of an answer was the answer. "All right," Ruth said. "Then let me ask you this. You finish doing whatever that is. You sleep well tomorrow night, and the morning after that, some mother in Bushwick walks her child into the pharmacy with the broken doorbell, pays $9, and carries home an inhaler that pumps out air. No matter who you kill, that inhaler will still be sitting on the shelf. It's there tonight. It's there right now while we're standing here." She pointed toward the window, toward the darkness outside. "Tomorrow, another child will buy one," Bruno said. "You don't understand this." "I understand the shelf," Ruth said. The silence lasted a very long time. Then Augustin Falcone took off his coat and draped it over the back of the chair, and he sat down, and he said, "Bruno, call the men." That night lasted 9 hours. Ruth would remember it not as a scene from a movie, but as a work shift. There was coffee in a glass pot with the bottom burned black, and no one finished a cup. There was a metal table covered in papers. There were 3 telephones, and Augie used all 3. And he didn't raise his voice once, and that was the most frightening thing Ruth had ever witnessed, because he spoke to people in the tone someone might use to ask the time. And on the other end of the line, people got out of bed and dressed. He didn't explain the reason to anyone. He gave the name of a pharmacy, said what needed to be taken, said where it had to be brought, and ended the call. Ruth sat beside him with a paper map. Bruno had handed her a phone, and she pushed it back toward him. "I don't trust that," she said, and she didn't explain, and Bruno looked at her, then went to a drawer and brought out the company map. Old, torn at the edges, marked with circles and ballpoint pen by someone many years before. Ruth spread it open. She marked every location. She wrote the batch number in capital letters across the upper corner, and she read it to each person one at a time, slowly, character by character, repeating it a second time, the same way she had read it over the phone to a woman somewhere on the other end of a line. Someone asked her to repeat it. She read it a third time. She didn't become impatient. She understood exactly how important that sequence was, because she was the only person in the room who had ever read it before it meant anything. At 1 o'clock in the morning, there were 7 locations. At 2, 11. At 3, Bruno came in and placed a heavy plastic bag on the table without saying anything, and Ruth looked through the plastic and saw them. Dozens of inhalers, genuine casings, genuine labels, and she had to turn her face away. By 4 o'clock in the morning, it was finished. 17 locations from Greenpoint through Bushwick, down into Ridgewood, and as far as Elmhurst, and at each one, someone had knocked on the door of a Bayham's sleeping pharmacist and spoken one brief sentence, and the shelves had been cleared, and there had been no noise, no newspapers, and by morning the things had vanished across Brooklyn and Queens as though they had never been there. No one called the police. No one thanked anyone. The sky began turning gray beyond the window. Ruth folded the map, following every old crease exactly, because she always folded things along their original lines. Augie sat at the far end of the table, his tie removed long ago, and he looked at the pile of papers and said, without looking at her, "No one will ever know we did this." Ruth stood. She put on her coat, the coat she had worn through 4 winters. "I've cleaned houses for 10 years, she said. "No one has ever known what I do. Get used to it." Then she walked toward the door. She stopped. "Eat something. You've been lying to me, too." He waited for her at the Polish Cafe on Manhattan Avenue, the place where she had eaten breakfast since her mother was still alive, and he had already ordered her a cup of coffee, exactly the way she always took it. Ruth noticed that before she noticed his face. "Miss Sawicki," Raymond DeLuca said, and he stood when she reached the table, then pulled out the chair for her. "Tell me if I've taken your usual seat. I notice someone tends to sit over in that corner." She sat down. She didn't touch the coffee. He wore thin framed glasses, had a paper napkin folded into quarters beside his plate, and looked like a man who had come to audit the accounts of an elementary school. "I don't know you," Ruth said. "No, but I know this place." He smiled. "The owner is a friend of my aunt's. It's a small world." Then, calmly as though discussing the weather, he said, "Is the boy doing better?" "Pete." Ruth didn't move. That was the whole blow, and both of them knew it. He didn't threaten her. He didn't look at her in any particular way. He had simply placed her younger brother's name on the table between them, the way someone might set down a key, and then he drank his coffee. I have a nephew with the same problem, he said. It's hard. In winter, no one in the family sleeps. Ruth waited. He wasn't in a hurry. That man was never in a hurry. He finished his pastry, wiped his hands with the napkin folded into quarters, then reached inside his coat, took out an envelope, and placed it on the table between the 2 cups of coffee. He didn't push it toward her. He simply left it there. Ruth looked at it. She didn't need to open it. She had lived her entire life inside numbers, and she knew that thickness by sight, the way a carpenter knew a plank by sight, and as she sat in that cafe, she understood that the small object lying on the table was exactly as thick as her life. It was as thick as the sheet of paper with the number in the lower right corner. It was as thick as the polite voice of a man named Fitzgerald. It was as thick as 10 years. You don't have to do anything, Raymond said. Let me be clear about that. No one is asking you to lie. No one is asking you to sign anything. You only have to forget a string of numbers. You never read it. You're a cleaning woman. You don't read medication labels. Who reads medication labels? He shrugged. That's the truth, isn't it? No one reads them. Ruth looked at him. You knew it was counterfeit, she said. He didn't blink. He didn't deny it. And that was the moment Ruth Sawicki knew for certain. Miss Sawicki, he said gently, do you know where you're sitting? You're sitting in a cafe in your own neighborhood. It takes you 4 minutes to walk home. I'm not saying that to frighten you. I'm saying it because I want you to understand that I don't need to frighten you. I'm simply offering you something anyone sitting in your chair would accept. Ruth picked up the coffee and took a sip. It was exactly the way she always drank it. You're right about one thing, she said. No one reads the label. She set the cup down. But you're wrong about my job. I've cleaned houses for 10 years. Do you know what that taught me? It didn't teach me how to clean. Anyone can clean. It taught me how to smell. I walk into a house and I know what's rotting inside before the owner does. People spray perfume. They put fresh flowers in the living room. They polish the floors until they shine. It doesn't matter. I can smell something decaying from within. She looked directly at him. You've been sitting here all this time, and you smell wonderful. Then she reached out with 2 fingers and pushed the envelope back across the table until it touched his cup. She stood. She put on her coat. She opened her wallet, counted out the change, and placed the money for her coffee on the table. Rumors didn't travel through words. They traveled through empty spaces. A contractor in Maspeth didn't return a call. A meeting in Ozone Park was postponed, then postponed again, and then no one mentioned it anymore. A man from the union didn't rise when Augie entered the room, and he had a reason. His back hurt. Everyone knew his back hurt, and Augie sat in the car for 20 minutes afterward without saying a word. 3 people in uniform had seen him on the floor of his own home. A file bearing his name sat inside a system anyone with enough money could buy their way into, and the entire city didn't need to know what illness he had. The entire city only needed to know that he could crack. People in Manhattan smelled it before the people in Brooklyn did, and they chose that exact week, and they chose the weakest door. The warehouse in Red Hook was cold. Its ceiling was high, and the sound of footsteps echoed through it before fading away. Augie stood in the middle of the concrete floor with both hands in the pockets of his coat, and Bruno Castellano came in alone, with no one waiting outside, and nothing in his hands. He walked straight to a place a few steps from Augie and stopped. You know, Bruno said. I know, no one shouted. That was what Augie would remember about that night for the rest of his life, that inside that freezing warehouse, there wasn't a sound louder than the breathing of 2 men. My daughter, Bruno said. The older one. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Augie had eaten at his table. Augie had held the girl in his arms before she knew how to walk. Raymond sent flowers every year on her birthday and signed Augie's name beneath the card. They came to see me that week, Bruno said. That exact week. Do you understand? For 30 years, no one came to see me. For 30 years, I used the back door and no one knew my face. Then suddenly that week, people knew my name, knew my daughter's name, even knew the school she attended in 3rd grade. He stopped. They didn't threaten me, Augie. They only handed me 2 sheets of paper and told me to choose. That wasn't a choice. They called it a choice, but it wasn't. Augie didn't move. How long? Since that day. Bruno nodded toward nowhere. Not before. Do you think I sat in that car all those years and laughed in your face? No, it was from that day. From that morning. Then the two men stood motionless inside the warehouse, both of them making the same calculation, both of them knowing the other was making it, and neither of them speaking it aloud. That morning. The morning a woman took the service elevator to the 32nd floor, opened the wrong door, and saved a man's life. Bruno drew in a breath, and he spoke in the voice people used when talking to family at a funeral. Do you remember what I said about the cleaning girl? Augie didn't answer. Hungry people will sell anything, Bruno looked at him. I wasn't talking about her, Augie. I stood in your kitchen and said those words, and I was confessing to you. I had met with them 4 hours earlier. He gave one small shrug. And you didn't hear me. Somewhere outside, a ship's horn sounded across the water. I kept this name unbroken for 30 years, Bruno said. Not one crack. Then my daughter was put in handcuffs in a supermarket parking lot, and I sat in that room while they asked me, Mr. Castellano, who do you love more? He lifted his head. What would you do? If it were your child, what would you do? Augie stood there for a long time. He didn't wear a watch. He had never needed to know what time it was. But as he stood in that warehouse in Red Hook close to midnight, for the first time in his life, he wanted to know just how late it had become. Go, he said. Bruno Castellano looked at him for one more second. Then he turned his back, walked across the concrete floor, and the sound of his footsteps echoed and faded. And he went out through that door, and Augustin Falcone never saw him again. They brought Raymond DeLuca into that warehouse 3 nights later, and he didn't struggle, and he said nothing on the way there. They made him kneel on the concrete floor, in the middle of a pool of yellow light, and his thin framed glasses were still on his face, slightly crooked, and he raised one hand to straighten them as though that were the most important thing in the world at that moment. Augie stood several steps away from him. On the floor between them lay a plastic bag. Inside were dozens of inhalers. Open it and look, Augie said. I don't need to open it, silence. You know what it is, I know what it is, you made it. I didn't make it, Raymond said, and his voice was still the same voice he used in the kitchen, warm, slow, without the slightest trace of defensiveness. Some people in Jersey made it. I only moved it. That's what I do, Augie. I move things. I move flowers for weddings, I move envelopes for funerals, I move this. It's cheap, no one inspects it, and it flows into neighborhoods no one ever inspects. You banned drugs. You said no drugs. This isn't a drug. This is air, Augie said nothing. You never asked, Raymond said. For 20 years, you never once asked me where the money came from. Then Augie spoke the sentence he had been carrying inside himself for 3 nights. My inhaler. Raymond looked up, and this was the part all of New York would have misunderstood, had New York ever learned of it, which New York never would. I didn't touch your inhaler, he said. Never. I didn't have to, he continued, and he told the truth, and that truth was worse than any lie could have been. I renewed your prescription. I told the kid to pick it up. I didn't ask where he got it, because for 20 years I haven't asked. Because that's what you do when you're the person who takes care of everything. You don't ask. Then one day I looked at the inhaler in your hand and saw the label. And I recognized that label. I recognized it because I had signed the papers that put that batch on the truck. He stopped. I had about 3 seconds, Augie. I stood in your kitchen, and I had 3 seconds. What did you say? I didn't say anything. The warehouse was silent. Do you understand? Raymond said. I didn't kill you. I didn't switch anything. I didn't arrange any of it. I simply kept my mouth shut. I kept my mouth shut, handed you the box of pastries, asked how you were feeling, and went home. What are you going to hang me for? For doing nothing? He looked up, and for the first time in his life he wasn't smiling. You did nothing for 20 years, too. You just didn't know you were doing nothing. Augie stood on the concrete floor, and those words entered him and didn't leave, because they were true. He had forbidden drugs, and he had believed that forbidding them was enough, and not once in 20 years had he gone down to the lowest level of the thing he had built to see what was there. He had lived on the 32nd floor. He had 4 bedrooms and slept in one. He had a refrigerator with nothing inside except water and medicine, and that medicine had traveled from some truck in Jersey, through the hands of some boy, through the hands of his cousin, and all the way to his table, and not one person in that chain had asked a single question, because he had been the first not to ask. The thing that had strangled him on the floor of his own home wasn't an enemy. It was what he had built. It had traveled in a complete circle and returned to the exact place where it began, and it had rested inside the inner pocket of his coat for an entire year, and he had carried it with him at all times, as though it were a gun. "Stand up," Augie said. "No," Raymond said. "Whatever you intend to do, do it here. I know the rules. Your father taught them to me at the same time he taught you." Footsteps sounded behind them. Someone approached and handed Augustin Falcone something. It was heavier than he remembered. That was the first thought that crossed Augustin Falcone's mind, and it was a foolish thought, and he knew it was foolish the instant it came. He stood in the pool of yellow light inside the Red Hook warehouse, with that object in his hand, looking down at his cousin, kneeling on the concrete, his thin framed glasses carefully straightened on his face. No one in the warehouse said anything. This was the place where everyone knew what was about to happen. This was the place where the law had been written before anyone in that room was born. "You brought pastries to my home," Augie said. Raymond didn't look up. "You sat in my kitchen. You told me about that summer at Grandma's house. You told me about the machine that blew mist. You sat there and reminded me that you knew me before I was anything at all, and then you stood up and told me to eat the pastry." He breathed out. "And you waited." "Yes," Raymond said. "How long?" "Long enough." Augustin Falcone stood there. In his hand was the thing his father had once held. In his mind was the night his father sat at the head of the dining table and told a 10-year-old boy that there were 3 things they didn't touch, and that boy had nodded and believed that was enough. That once a law was spoken, it would live on its own, that forbidding something meant the matter was finished. And he looked down at Raymond DeLuca and saw a man who had watched for 3 seconds and said nothing. 3 seconds. He had been given 20 years. "My father would kill you," Augie said. Raymond looked up. "He would kill you tonight, in this exact place, and he would sleep peacefully, and tomorrow morning he would go to church." Augie looked at the object in his hand. "And my father died in prison, alone. No one came, he set it down. He didn't throw it. He bent and placed it carefully on the concrete floor, and the sound of metal touching concrete rang through that warehouse, louder than any gunshot could have been." No one breathed. "Stand up," he said. Raymond didn't move. I said, "Stand up." He stood. And Augustin Falcone delivered the sentence in the voice of a man reading a list. Every contract bearing Raymond's name would be taken back. Every route, every warehouse, every vehicle would be taken back. Every person who had ever answered his calls would answer no more. The house in Bensonhurst, his aunt's house, he could keep because it didn't belong to the organization. It belonged to her. Everything else was finished. And the name. From that night forward, no one from Bensonhurst to Ozone Park was permitted to call him family. No flowers, no envelopes, no chair at any table. If he became sick, no one would come. If he died, no one would carry him. "You live," Augie said. "You live a long time. I hope you live a very long time." Raymond DeLuca stood there, and his face didn't change, and then it did, only slightly, around the eyes, and Augie saw the exact moment the man understood. He had lived his entire life by being the person who knew everything about everyone, the person who remembered birthdays, the person who took care of everything. Now he would walk down 18th Street and no one would nod to him. "You know this is worse," Raymond said. "I know you aren't doing this because of me." "No," Augie said. "That's right." He left. The warehouse door opened onto a slice of darkness, then closed again, and the echo faded, and Raymond DeLuca walked out of the life in which he had waited 20 years to sit at the head of the table. Augie's men stood there for a long time. At last one of them spoke, quietly, because someone had to. "You just showed all of New York that you don't kill people." Augie looked at the object still lying on the concrete floor where he had placed it. He didn't pick it up. "I just showed all of New York that I don't need to kill people," he said. Then he walked toward the door, and before leaving, he stopped and said one more thing, in the voice of a man asking the time, and that sentence would travel through Brooklyn within a week. "Starting tomorrow, anything that passes through our hands gets opened, and we look inside. Anything we sell, we know what's in it. Anyone who can't do that can find somewhere else to work." He pushed open the door. Outside it was raining. Ruth came on a Tuesday afternoon, and she came by subway as she always did. And Bruno was no longer there to block the door, so she walked straight in. She placed Judith Amsel's paper on the metal desk. She hadn't read it again. Judith had told her not to, and Ruth had listened, but she had carried it in the pocket of her coat for weeks like a pebble trapped inside her shoe. "Someone asked about my brother's records," she said. "A stranger. She told me the way someone talks about the weather." Then she left, and I stood in my kitchen, and I kept thinking about it. She looked at him. Then I figured out who it was. Augustin Falcone didn't deny it. He didn't ask whom she suspected. He sat behind that desk and looked at the paper, and his face didn't change. And Ruth had learned that when this man's face didn't change, that was when something was happening inside him. "It was me," he said. Ruth sat down because her legs could no longer hold her. "I called the hospital. 3 days after that morning. I used another name." He continued in an even voice, without offering a single word in his own defense. "You left that apartment, and I didn't know who you were. I knew the name on the label. I knew there was a boy. I wanted to know whether the boy was all right. Was that all? That was all." Ruth sat motionless. "I asked about him," he said. "That was everything I did." And Ruth Sawicki sat in that room and listened to those words. And she felt something break inside her. Not anger, because anger would have been much easier, but something cold and clear as water from a faucet. "Do you know what happens when a stranger calls a hospital and asks about the records of an 11-year-old child?" she said. He didn't answer. They don't give you an answer. They don't answer you at all. They enter it into a box. Then that box triggers a switch, and that switch triggers another one. And 3 weeks later, a kind woman sits in my kitchen and hands me 2 pages that summarize my life in words I don't recognize. Her voice remained steady. That was what made it worse. She'll sit in that chair several more times. She told me so. She said, "Don't worry, this isn't an accusation, but once a case is opened, it has to go through the entire process." Do you know where that process leads? I do. I've known since I was 17. I've sat in those rooms before. Ruth looked directly at him. "You don't know how to ask about someone without leaving a mark." Augie sat in silence for a long time. Then he spoke, and he told the truth, and that truth was worse than an apology. "I know only one way to keep someone safe," he said. "You make them part of someone else's records. You put their name somewhere that forces people to ask why if they disappear. In my world, that is a wall. That is the best thing I know how to give someone." He looked down at his hands. "I didn't know that in your world it was a door." Ruth said nothing. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. "I can make calls. I know people. I can make that case disappear within a week." "No," she stood. "Don't you understand? That is exactly the problem. Everything you touch breaks. Not because you're cruel, because you're heavy. You move through people's lives the way a truck drives through someone's garden, and you honestly don't understand why all the vegetable beds have been crushed." Ruth picked up the paper and returned it to her pocket. "There's only one way you can help me." She walked toward the door. "Don't touch us again." The door closed. Augustin Falcone sat alone in the room with the metal desk, and he remained there until darkness fell. And during all that time, he didn't think about Raymond, didn't think about Bruno, didn't think about the warehouse. He thought about an 11-year-old boy he had never met, and about the telephone he had picked up, because he wanted to know whether that boy was all right. It came to her while she was waiting for the train at Nassau Avenue Station, and it came for no reason at all. She was staring at an advertisement peeling away from the station wall when suddenly she saw another wall. The wall in the hospital waiting room, the water dispenser, and beside the water dispenser, a pressed wood bulletin board covered with flyers, dozens of them overlapping one another, some curled at the edges, some with a corner torn away by someone taking the phone number. How many times had Ruth walked past that wall in 10 years? She had walked past it the night she signed the papers. She had walked past it with the rubber gloves still on her hands. She was someone who read everything in the world. She read bottle labels. She read the tiny print at the bottom of boxes. And not once in her life had she turned her head to the right and read that wall. Because she was always moving. Because people didn't stop in hospitals. Because walls like that were meant for other people. She boarded the train. She got off at the hospital. She stood before the pressed wood board and read it from top to bottom, one flyer at a time, the way she read everything, and it took her 20 minutes. There was one about flu vaccinations. There was one about quitting smoking. There was one about a support group that met on Tuesday evenings. And along the bottom row, close to the floor, where someone had to bend down to read it, there was a white sheet of paper with a single line of black print about free legal assistance for patients, and beneath it was a phone number. The paper had yellowed around the edges. It had been hanging there for years. The lawyer's name was Adeze Nwosu, and her office was half the size of Ruth's kitchen, in the same building as a laundromat. She listened to Ruth speak for 4 minutes, then raised one hand and told her to stop, and she asked whether Ruth had kept the paperwork, and Ruth opened her bag and placed on the desk everything she hadn't thrown away in 10 years. Adeze Nwosu looked at the pile, then looked at Ruth and said, "You kept all of this." Ruth said, "I keep everything." What happened afterward wasn't dramatic. It was paperwork. It was 3 months and 11 letters and 2 occasions when Adeze had to call again because no one had returned her call. That law had existed since before Ruth was born. It said that a nonprofit hospital in this state was required to consider financial assistance for patients whose income fell below a certain threshold. And Ruth had lived below that threshold for 10 years, and no one had ever told her that, and it wasn't because anyone was cruel. It was because no one had been assigned the duty of telling her, because that duty belonged to a sheet of paper taped to a wall. When the final letter arrived, Ruth sat at the kitchen table and read the new number, then read it again. She still owed money. She would continue making payments for another 2 years, but the pile of stones that had pressed against her chest for 10 years had become a single stone she could carry. She didn't cry. She folded the letter along its original creases and placed it inside the drawer. Augustin Falcone didn't pay a single cent. He didn't know. He never asked. The only thing he did was send a message containing one line, the name of a person and a time, and nothing else. That person was named Frank Oyalaran. He was a route coordination manager, 50 years old, and he didn't know who Ruth was, and he was irritated because someone had told him he had to interview one more applicant. Augie wasn't there. He hadn't called ahead. Ruth sat in the room with the fake plant, and Frank Oyalaran asked what experience she had, and Ruth said none. He nodded and looked at his watch. Then Ruth said, "I sat out there for 40 minutes, and I looked at the route board on your wall." He looked up. She said, "The truck assigned to Meeker runs on Tuesdays and Fridays. The truck assigned to Kingsland also runs on Tuesdays and Fridays. Those 2 roads intersect at the corner, which means 2 trucks pass the same block on the same morning twice every week. I live in that neighborhood. I've been watching 2 of your trucks do it since last year. I assumed there was a reason." Frank Oyalaran set down his pen. "Is there a reason?" Ruth asked. He didn't answer for a long time. 1 year later, Ruth Sawicki still rode the subway. That is the first thing that needs to be said, because people often imagine that stories like this end with a car. She still lived in the same apartment in Greenpoint. She still made payments every month. The only difference was that now, when an appointment fell in the middle of the morning, she didn't have to choose between her brother and the rent, and she knew she would never grow used to that. That night, she stayed late at the office to finish the new route schedule, and she heard it in the hallway before she saw anything. That sound. She had heard it all her life. The security guard was named Imika, 22 years old, leaning against the wall beside the vending machine, one hand gripping the machine, and he was trying to breathe in, and he was making the same mistake everyone made. Ruth reached into her pocket. There was one there. There was another in her desk drawer, and another in the cabinet at home, because now she had insurance, and the idea that one person could have 3 still felt strange to her. She knelt down. "Breathe all the way out," she said. "All the way first. Don't try to pull air in. Breathe everything out, then inhale when I tell you." He obeyed. She handed him the inhaler, counted for him, 4 counts in, 6 counts out, and waited until his chest opened. When he could breathe again, the first thing Emeka did was raise a hand to cover his face. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't want anyone to see." Ruth sat down on the floor beside him, leaving some distance between them, both hands resting on her knees. "These are your lungs," she said. "They aren't your character." She reached home close to 11 o'clock. Pete was 1 year older, wearing new glasses, with the airplane sticker transferred to the new frame, because he had made her peel it off and stick it on again. He was sitting at the kitchen table doing his homework, and when she hung her coat on the hook, he handed her a sheet of paper folded into quarters, its edges softened from being folded for so long. "I found this in my school bag," he said. "It's from when I was in the hospital." Ruth opened it. A cargo plane with a large belly, and inside it, an elephant. "I remember this. Turn it over," she did. There, in a child's uneven pencil writing from that day, were the words, "You lied about dropping the medicine. I knew you did, but I didn't ask any more questions. I knew you were too busy trying to breathe." Ruth stood in the kitchen for a very long time. The boy had never believed her. Not once. He had simply allowed her to lie because he knew she needed to tell the lie. And that was what a 12-year-old child had done for his sister through all those years without anyone knowing. "Ruth," Pete said, looking up from his homework. "Can you breathe?" Ruth folded the paper along its original creases. "Yes," she said. "I can breathe now." She poured herself a glass of water, stood by the window looking down at Greenpoint glowing with lights, and breathed. 4 counts in, 6 counts out. Sometimes the thing that saves a life isn't power, but the habit of someone who has never had enough to throw anything away. This story leaves behind a few very simple truths. That true kindness isn't giving when we have more than enough, but giving when we have only the last little bit left. That help can sometimes remain there for years, posted on a wall we pass every day, and the only thing we need to do is stop for 1 minute and read it. That the invisible people around us, the cleaners, the security guards, the people behind the counter, see far more than we imagine, and respecting them isn't charity, it is simply seeing them. And that illness is never something to be ashamed of, and neither is needing help, because these are our lungs, not anyone's character. If Ruth's story touched you even a little, please subscribe to our channel, press like, and share it so that every day we can bring you more stories worth hearing. How did this story make you feel? Was there a moment that made you think of someone in your own life? Please leave a comment below. We truly want to hear the feelings that come from deep within your heart. May you and your family always be blessed with good health, joy, and peace in every day of your lives. Goodbye for now, and we will see you again in the next video.